Good morning, everybody online. Good morning, everybody here in person.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's great to see that by every Sunday our numbers grow. Yeah. So welcome. Those who have been here, welcome back. Those who are coming for the first time, welcome for the first time. Today we're going to be talking about Saul's inseparable companions. And by Saul, I'm talking about Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul of Tarsus. And the story that I'm going to tell is in this book, Paul and Stephen, which I dare say is one of my favorite books in Spiritism, and I think it's a must-read for people who are starting, for people who already are Spiritists, for those who aren't Spiritists. Everybody, I think, should read this book, and it's such an amazing book. So today's story, I'm going to talk about Saul, but a specific moment in time where we would find Saul after about 3 years since he was on the road to Damascus and Jesus came to him and he converted himself to a follower of Jesus. Then he spent 1,000 days in the desert working himself and all of that. And then he comes back and he goes back to Jerusalem. He's at the Church of the Way at this time. And this is a little bit of the context, the background. He was at the Church of the Way at that time. And a lot of the people there, a lot of the disciples of Christ, they did not fully accept him. And some couldn't even forgive him for everything he's done. Because when he was still very strongly with Judaism, he was a persecutor of Christians, and he arrested a lot of the people and a lot of the families of those who were at the Church of the Way. So, and there was even apostles like James, for instance, who was a little skeptical of him, wasn't very accepting of Saul. So Saul was trying to belong. He was trying to fit in at the Church of the Way among the other followers of Christ. But he was finding it hard to do so. So he starts to think, maybe I'll go back, find support with my father in Tarsus, because he was very much rooted in his family and everything. And then Simon Peter tells him, I think you should maybe consider going back to your father, because, and he says something that I think was very interesting. He says, Simon Peter says to Saul, he says, we must view the new state of your soul as a precious plant that has just begun to sprout. So he talks about Saul's newly found faith in Christ, his passion for following the teachings of Christ as this plant that is just starting to sprout. And he said that the seed of your convictions, this is Simon Peter telling Saul, the seed of your convictions would find 1,000 hostile elements, and perhaps you would be at the mercy of exasperation, meaning you're going to find a lot of difficulties here, Saul, if you stay here. And then Saul decides to go and walk about Jerusalem. And in this walk, he sees these things that he used to see when he was living there. And one of those things was the synagogue. So he decides to go in with a nostalgic feeling. He goes in the synagogue and to watch the service there. But even there, he got an icy reception from his fellow Jewish colleagues from before. And not only got an icy reception, but as the service progressed, they started to gossip about him, mumble things, and say foul words about him, saying that he has gone insane because the Christ must have put some spell on him, and all of those things. So even there, where he was so welcome before, where he was touted as the jewel of the Jews, per se, as such an amazing athlete, so young, so smart, so knowledgeable as a rabbi, but then now he was converted. So even at the synagogue, he was not very well accepted. And then he was holding himself, but then as we see in the book, there comes a moment at the end that he goes to the podium and he starts to argue with them. And he starts to argue, and words are exchanged, and people become inflamed, and they're like, this cannot go on, and this and that. And Saul leaves, and he starts to pray. He starts to pray as soon as he leaves the synagogue. And then it says that a luminous form, meaning like a luminous, as in from light, comes to him and says, you must leave Jerusalem. Your colleagues will not understand you right now. They're not understand you as of this moment. And Saul thinks that's Jesus talking to him again. So he goes back to the Church of the Way, talks with Simon Peter and says, Jesus spoke with me, but in reality we'll see that that's Stephen, the one he persecuted from before, who was still following his footsteps, even after he passed. So he tells that to Simon Peter, And then Simon Peter says, yeah, I think that it's best. And I heard about the things that happen in the synagogue already, and I don't know if we're going to be able to protect you while you're there, like while you're here. You know, I think the best thing maybe is for you to just leave the city for now and be, you know, away for a while, work on yourself, work on your faith and all those things. So he gives this very sage advice to Saul of Tarsus. And then Saul leaves basically on the same night, because they were already talking about how they're going to come get him, arrest him, and there was nothing that Simon Peter or the other other disciples could do to help him. So he leaves for Tarsus in search of his father. And when he gets there, his father welcomes him at first, like 3 years after, like, since you've left, oh, where were you? I heard all these things about you. But as they start to talk, his father notices that Saul is, in fact, a follower of Christ. And then they start to argue. And they start to have this argument that was very hurtful for Saul. He starts to cry. His father admonishes him for crying. And all those things start to pile up. And we can only imagine how Saul was feeling in this moment. And his father even says, and forces him to choose. He says, it's either me or the despicable carpenter. So it's either me or Jesus. And Saul chooses Jesus. So his father banishes him. He leaves. As he's about to leave, a servant of his father comes with a pouch of coins to help him and says, your father gave you this. He grabs that pouch, but he even wavers. He's like, I don't think I'm going to grab this pouch because I want to show him I'm no beggar. But he decides to accept that, and he leaves. As he leaves, he goes and eats a light meal, and with a zillion things going on in his mind, he eats a light meal. But the hubbub of the city is too much for him. So he said, I need to go to a place where I can find some rest, where I can find some silence, some solitude, so I can pray. And I can collect my thoughts and see what I'm going to do with my life now. Because he was not accepted in Jerusalem. He's going to get arrested there. He was not accepted between those that he was a part of now, the followers of Christ. And he was not accepted with his old colleagues and with Judaism. So he wasn't accepted anywhere. Even in his own house, he was banished. His family was shattered. He had no base, basically, except for his faith in Jesus, that Jesus was going to help him all the way through. So it says that he goes to a cavern in the Taurus Mountains, which is nowadays Turkey, and one of the abandoned caves there. He goes in, he lays in the rocks, among the rocks, and he falls asleep. And this is where the lecture today is going to start, because we're going to be talking about an episode, I rather say kind of famous, as other talks have been, about the Abigail's words or Abigail's mottos. Because as he was there lying on that cave, what happened was he dreamed. But what happened, in fact, was his spirit was transported to this spiritual plane while he was asleep, where he says that it was very different from, he describes it very different from everything that he had experienced until then. Flowers were great, the bushes were very green, the warm breeze welcomed him, and he could even hear music in the air. Heavenly music in the air. But then he sees two people approaching him. And that's Abigail and Stephen, who have been there all along with him. And they start to talk. Oh, I'm sorry. Saul starts to cry, and he begins to tell them everything he's feeling, all of those emotions bubbling up and everything. And then they start to console him. And then Stephen even says, Saul, don't worry about my forgiveness. Everybody sins. Only Jesus was sinless, And then they keep going back and forth. They are restoring his hope and his faith and everything. And then what happens is they leave. Thank you. Stephen then leaves, and then Abigail stays. Abigail was his love. And then he starts to catalog or list a bunch of questions he has in his mind. She's about to leave. I don't want her to leave. But she was such a spirit of luminescence that he's like, I want to ask her everything that I need to ask in order to continue with my journey that Jesus chose me to. And I have faith, but my faith has been shaken. So he starts to ask her a bunch of questions, and this is what we're going to get into, because each of those 4 lessons that she's going to teach him, I want to dive a little deeper to see how that applied to Saul back then and how that applies to us in our own lives. That's one of my favorite things about Spiritism, is how we can apply these knowledges to ourselves and in our own lives, in our own individual growth. So one of the things he asks is, what could he do to acquire a perfect understanding of Christ's design? Love. Love here is in imperative form. So she's saying love. Love. The second is, what could he do for his soul to reach such an elevated expression of effort in Jesus Christ? Work. What measures could he adopt against such destructive discouragement? Hope nonetheless. And the last one was, how was he to reconcile the grand lessons of the gospel with human indifference? Forgive. All of those in the imperative. So those are the 4 words or 4 lessons that are very well known in lectures like this as Abigail's words or Abigail's motto, M-O-T-T-O. And then now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each one of them, and I have the text a little longer in its origin here. Saul then made an effort, because as he saw Stephen left, he saw that Abigail was about to leave. So Saul made an effort to hurriedly list all his spiritual needs, desirous to hear her on the problems facing him. And there were quite a lot of problems there. Anxious to make the most of the smallest fragment of the glorious fleeting minute, Saul mentally arrayed a large number of questions. Imagine ourselves now, pause. If you were in contact with somebody like that, what would you ask them? He needed those words. He needed that knowledge, that hope renewed inside of him. So he was trying to get, okay, what questions can I ask? Because she's going to leave. This moment will end, unfortunately. And the first one was this one. What could he do to acquire a perfect understanding of Christ's designs? A perfect, and I bolded perfect there, because there's only one way, and it's through love. Through the actual sentiment, the elevated blessing that is love, to love. And now we're going to get the word love, or the concept of love, and study a little bit more and see what other books can we learn from about love. So the Gospel according to Spiritism talk about this. It says, love is of divine essence. And everyone, from the most humble to the most elevated, has a spark of the sacred fire in the bottom of their hearts. So we are all beings of light, meaning we're all beings of love. We all have that spark in our hearts, the capability of loving, truly loving. The law of love, and this is still from the Gospel, is the first and most important precept of the new doctrine, because one day it will destroy all selfishness under whatever form it may present itself. Moral betterment of the human race and happiness during terrestrial life are the results which the law of love will bring. In the superior spheres and planets, reciprocated love harmonizes and directs the advanced spirits which inhabit them. So it's the most powerful feeling even in those, and it's reciprocated in those worlds. And we're going to get there. We will get there one day, where we are at that level in those worlds. Not now. Because right now, even as we learn from the Gospel according to Spiritism, our own evolution of our sentiments go through first instincts. That's what the Gospel says. We start with instincts. Much like animals have instincts. After that, we have sensations. So imagine like growing and ascending in order of complexity. So we start with instincts, then we have sensations. After sensations, we have sentiments. And love is at the apex of all those sentiments, according to the Gospel. The Gospel according to Spiritism. And right now, if we think about it, how many times our actions and the world's actions are driven by sensations, not necessarily sentiments. So right now, we're still very much influenced by the matter. We're still very much influenced by these sensations, not necessarily the sentiments. But the progression is there. The progression is delineated in front of us, our path that we must trail. And if we go to The Living Spring, which is a beautiful book with a lot of messages, and for those who haven't seen my lectures yet, I like to put on the top corner left the picture of the book. So if you like what you see in the slide, maybe already go to the library, purchase some of the books, and help yourself in the center as well. So in The Living Spring, psychographed by Chico, by Emmanuel, we learn that those who love their neighbor know above all to understand. But if we really do love the brother or sister on our path, the scenery of our life changes because the light of love bathes our vision. Look how beautiful this is. Therefore, love, just as mud can never offend light, offense can never reach you, can never touch you. Apologize. And I underline mud and light, and I'll bring this message back later on and explain why I underlined there. And this is from a book by Divaldo, psychographed by Divaldo, by Joanna. We don't have that in English, unfortunately, but it'd be Love, Unbeatable Love, the title, where she only talks about love. And in this book, she says, love is the creative and maintaining substance of the universe, made of divine essence. It is a treasure that the more it is shared, the more it multiplies and becomes richer as it's shared. Look at that. The more we divide it, the more we share it, the more it multiplies, which seems almost contradictory. And the more it's multiplied, the richer it becomes as it's shared. And that's love. That's the apex of all sentiments, love. And she goes on by saying, just as air is indispensable for organic existence, love is oxygen for the soul, without which it weakens and loses the meaning of living. So she says indispensable. That's a strong word. It's a very meaningful word, indispensable. So love is indispensable for air is indispensable for organic existence. And she makes the comparison between air and love to us. The second thing that we learn from Abigail, so the Abigail, the first was love. So the second one, and this is the text in the book, says, but how could he proceed in order to grow richer in divine virtues? Jesus ordered us to love even our enemies. He realized, however, how difficult it would be to do that. It was difficult to practice devotion without others' real comprehension. What could he do for his soul to reach such an elevated expression of effort in Jesus Christ? And she says, work. And this is an interesting piece here because she talks also about, he's saying it was difficult to practice devotion without others' real comprehension. Because remember, let's bring back to what Saul was facing. A lot of incomprehension. A lot of the feeling of being an outcast in everywhere he went. So how could he practice that when everybody seemed to be against him or not accepting of his renewed faith? So for that, and this conversation happens like 2-3 pages before, where Abigail tells him that even the master, with capital M, Jesus, did not have the full support or even his closest ones. In the end, when he was at the cross, some were sleeping, some betrayed him, some didn't want to be there. Even Jesus didn't have that. So she's saying to Saul, how could you expect to have that? And I think this is an interesting piece because it connects well with her second tip, let's call it, her second advice, which is to work. And if we go to the Spirit's book, what can we learn about work? Question 674. Is the necessity of labor a law of nature? And labor there is a British spelling. Because that's what I have in my book. So it says that labor is a law of nature and is proved by the fact that it is a necessity and that civilization obliges man to perform a greater amount of labor because it increases the sum of his needs and his enjoyments. So it is this necessity that we have, this law of labor, that we all must labor, we all must work. Our only question must be on what? And on what direction is our work heading towards? The following question says, ought we understand by labor only occupations of a material nature? Meaning like only those things that perhaps we get paid for? It says no. The spirit labors like the body. Every sort of useful occupation is a labor. And this is great. I love this answer because it says useful occupation. Because a lot of those useful occupations are not necessarily paid. A lot of those things we do as far as labor and in our work with God and with Jesus is not necessarily paid. Because the Spirit is irrespective of the material piece. And now going to the gospel, according to Spiritism. From an earthly point of view, the maxim, seek and ye shall find, is the same as the other one. Help yourself and the heavens will come to your aid. And this is what happened with Saul. Think about it. The heavens came to his aid in the form of two spiritual benefactors in the form of Stephen and Abigail. This is the base of the law of work and consequently the law of progress. Since progress is the child of work, seeing that this puts into action the force of intelligence. So it's saying that the law of progress progress is the child of work. So the law of progress passes through work. That's basically what this is. It's the basis for that. If God had exempted men, this is still from the gospel according to Spiritism. If God had exempted man from bodily work, his limbs would have withered. If he had exempted him from intellectual work, then his spirit would have remained in a state of infancy or mere animal instinct. So we need work. For the body, for the spirit, we need work. And it's even saying here that if we are not putting those forces to use, that the body, the intellect, everything we have at our disposal, we're going to remain in the state of infancy in our spirits. And if we go back to what we learned with love, instincts, sensations, and sentiments, we're not going to be able to reach that sentiment piece if we're not putting what we have available to good use. On the book The Way, the Truth, and the Life, which is a book of messengers psychographed by Chico by Emmanuel, we also learn a little bit more about work. This is the message number 4 entitled Work. It says, everywhere we look, we see unhappy, Emmanuel is saying, complaining people. The problem, however, is not the job, but the understanding of the opportunity. And this is, I think, was so impactful. It's not the job itself, but the understanding of the opportunity that is granted to us, that's given to us, for us to rise up and embrace that. So that we may know how to honor our own endeavor, Jesus referred to the Father who never stops working on his eternal endeavor of love and wisdom. So our Father, our Heavenly Father, never stops working. Jesus never stops working. We must always be aiming to work. There is rest in between, yes. We won't get to that today. But we always must be striving to work in between. When you feel tired, remember that Jesus is working. That's what he says in the end there. We started our humble undertaking only yesterday, but the Master has been toiling for us for how long? The Master has been working for us for how long? For much longer than we can even comprehend. Much, much longer. And he's saying just yesterday. And Emmanuel is great at using these analogies. Then we move to the third thing that Abigail tells him. So this is from the book. It was necessary to work for inner progress. This is Saul's thinking about it. He ardently desired to do so. For this reason, he had isolated himself in the desert for more than 1,000 days to work on himself while he was in the desert there. However, upon returning to the environment of collective effort at the side of former friends, he had nourished blossoming hopes that soon turned into heartbreaking bewilderment. So his hopes were dashed because he came back to cold shoulders, to cold stares, to lies, to disrespect. And from those in the Church of Way, a lot of them, skepticism, lack of forgiveness, because they would remember that what that same person did a few years ago to them, and to Stephen, and to all of those. So they were still struggling to forgive him. So he came with blossoming hopes to be perhaps embraced and accepted, and he didn't find that. So then he asks Abigail, what measures could he adopt against such destructive discouragement? And she says, hope nonetheless. And this is an interesting part here that I want to mention, because in the book, the book written in Portuguese, the word is slightly different. the literal translation of that word would be to wait. But I love what the translator did here, because it added the word nonetheless, meaning like despite everything, and also hope. But the hope is different than waiting, if you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
In my view, as I started to think about this more and more, to me, the way I conceptualize is that hope, different than wait, hope, there's two pillars for that. Faith and patience. That's hope. When you have this hope that things will get better. This is part of his own trials and tribulations that Saul was going to have to accept and endure in order to evolve, in order to be able to spread the gospel and become Paul the apostle that did so many great things. And same thing with us. When we're going through these heartbreaking bewilderments that we go through in our lives, we must always keep our hope, no matter what happens. So hope nonetheless, then, if we go to the Spiritist book on the question 982. So it talks about Spiritism teaches us to bear our trials with patience and resignation. Remember I said faith and patience? Turns us from the wrongdoing that would delay our future happiness and contributes to our attainment of that happiness. So patience and resignation. Look how beautiful that is, if we could only understand and utilize that. And then there's this little message here on the Spiritist book that says, O human race, into the entrails of the earth in search of chastisements, weep, but hope. But take comfort in the thought of a God who is entirely loving, absolutely powerful, essentially just. And this is the faith piece that I mentioned with hope that I think is very important here for us to understand and internalize. Because if we have that faith that there's a God that is immensely just, absolutely powerful, and entirely loving, we have no reason not to hope, not to have that faith. And interestingly, who said that, and it's in the Spiritist book, was the bearded guy from long time ago, Plato. In the gospel according to Spiritism, we have that faith, which is real and sincere, is always calm. It permits patience, which knows how to wait. Because having its foundation in intelligence, which is the faith with intelligence, and the understanding of life, it is certain of reaching the objective it aspires to. So this is rational faith, as we like to say in Spiritism. It's not blind faith, it's rational faith. And then if we go back, for instance, to what happened in Damascus, on the road to Damascus with Saul, when Jesus appeared to him, he was blind and all of that, he acquired a lot of faith that day and throughout the following 3 years that he was away. But when he came back to Jerusalem, his faith was tested. His resolve was very much shaken and tested when he came back. And in that moment, it says here, vacillating faith feel its own weakness. And that's what happened with him. In that moment, he had that vacillating faith, that wavering faith, because he said that there's no way, like Abigail, there's no way there. He was so overwhelmed with a heavy mind and a crushed heart that his faith was wavering, was vacillating. And that was the weakness, and that's why Abigail comes and says, hope nonetheless. If we go to 2 books of messages about faith and hope and patience, we look at message number 32, on the way, the truth, and the life. And this message is entitled Clouds. And it says, people's minds are usually focused on the clouds that appear on the horizon. These are clouds of disappointment, frustrated plans, and dashed hopes. And this is what was happening with Saul. These clouds that were on the horizon, that he was experiencing them, he was feeling them, he was focusing too much on them, of his dashed hopes. And that's what we do sometimes as well. And in the book Our Daily Bread, psychographed by Chico, message number 18, Trials by Fire, says, character, love, faith, patience, and hope represent achievements for the life eternal, accomplished by individuals with the holy assistance of the Master, with capital M. But all disciples must expect experiences which at the right moment will try their spiritual character. It's almost as if this message was made for that moment in Saul's life. Which I dare say that it was such a pivotal moment in his life when he slept in that cave and he had that experience. Because I can only wonder what his path would have been perhaps if he had continued without that aid. Or the path of Christianity, because we know how much Paul later on was so fundamental to spreading the gospel, to doing so much for the doctrine of Jesus Christ. So in that moment, he was experiencing that trial and that tribulation that we see here in the message, and this testing his spiritual character, his resolve. And then we move to the last of the 4 things that Abigail told him. But, this is what it says in the book, what about other people? Saul, in fact, realized that overall agreement regarding the teachings of the divine master represented one of the most difficult tasks besetting the unfolding of the gospel. But more than that, people also seemed uninterested in the truth of the enlightenment. And this part here, he's referring obviously because to him, when he was seeing the church of the way, even there, we had, for instance, James and some of the people with James that were reading the law of Moses. They were like leaning way more towards Judaism back again. Whereas you had Simon Peters and some of the others more like, let's follow Christ's teaching, this and that. Let's not forget what our mentor and master taught us. So there was a divide even there. And Saul was wondering what to do when people don't seem to have an agreement, even in those things that he thought were agreed, not easy, but understandably agreed upon. And then Saul continues here, saying he agreed that loving, working, and hoping, so the other 3 things that she told him, were indispensable. But how was he to behave amongst such diverse forces? How was he to reconcile the grand lessons of the gospel with human indifference? And this is, the indifference piece there it's almost too reductive in a way, because he was met not only with indifference, but with hostility, with hatred, with all these things, with people just absolutely disregarding him, disrespecting him. But even with indifference, how was he to reconcile those grand lessons with that? And then Abigail says, forgive. So that's the 4th lesson that she teaches him. The 4th thing that she tells him to do, forgive. And with that, let's learn a little bit more about forgiveness as well. In the book, The Way, the Truth, and the Life, we have on the message number 170 called Spiritual Control, we have this passage here that says, the cross did not change Jesus' serenity, and while on it, he asked forgiveness for the crowd's ignorance. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And this is beautiful if we think about it, how in that dire moment of emotional pain, probably physical pain for sure, probably, I guess, Jesus, even in that moment, asked for forgiveness for all of those there, because they did not know what they were doing. And that was the lesson, so strong. And even Chico says that forgiveness is such a difficult lesson that Jesus left it to the end. The last lesson, yeah. And I brought the same message from before, message 159 with love that we looked when we're talking about love. And this is the second part of the message that connects very well, because now it's going to talk about forgiveness. You will learn to listen without disgust, even if crime reaches your ears. And you will help your adversary, even when you feel offended, because forgiveness combined with complete forgetfulness for the blows you have received will arise spontaneously in your spirit. Just as tolerance is natural for the spring that receives the stones that are cast into it. Notice that I have underlined 4 words there: mud and light, spring and stones. And this is one of the things I love that Emmanuel does, which is the parallel, between the physical and the spiritual, perhaps. Because if we think about it, he's using 2 contrasting pieces here: mud and light. The spring and the stones. So mud and the stone, so like something coarse, something dirty, lesser feelings, lesser emotions, they cannot offend the light, the spring, which is an example of serenity, of tolerance. So those two things rise above the stone and the mud. And this is beautiful too, because if we think about love and forgiveness, those two sentiments rise above those sentiments that relate more to mud and stones. And this book we unfortunately don't have it in Portuguese, in English. I hope one day they will, because I love this book. It's called Harvest of Light. It's from the Living Spring collection. This one is the message number 21, the best for us. And it says, on days when offense hits us in the face, forgiveness, much more than a blessing for our supposed offenders, is and will always be the best for us. Those who harm us or hurt us often find themselves so attached to their own distress that deep down they suffer more than us. So those people in that moment in Saul's life, those people who have offended him, if he could only understand that forgiveness is the best for him, and again, let's bring to our own lives, forgiveness is the best for us, because those who are harboring those sentiments of hatred against us, they are carrying a weight that we cannot even comprehend, and it's not our weight. And they are carrying that. We must forgive. And we must reach that forgiveness through that, because as it says on the message here, is and will always be the best for us to forgive, despite what the other person is doing. If they're forgiving you or not, if they're still carrying feelings towards you, forgiving is of utmost importance. And then we have the famous, I put it here, forgive, up to 7 times? And this is, of course, a reference to Matthew chapter 18 in the Bible, where Peter comes to Jesus and says, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? And then he says, up to 7 times. And I have said this in previous lectures about forgiveness, but I imagine myself in that situation. Simon Peter, knowing the grandiosity of Jesus, knowing how hard it was to forgive probably, I think he volunteered a number there, thinking it was too much, like 7 times. In his mind, in that moment, he's probably thinking 1 is hard, 2 is very hard, 3 is too much. 7 times? And then Jesus looks at him and says, nah, 70 times 7. And I've seen some translations of the Bible say 77, which is still a lot. 70 times 7 is 490 times. Wow. For those who don't want to do math right now. It's a lot. It's way more than 7. So imagine Peter in that moment when he says up to 7 times. No, 70 times 7. He's probably taken aback for a few seconds like, oh, okay. This is way worse and way harder than I thought. And there's even a story that says that Chico Xavier was doing a lecture one day, and then a woman came to him afterwards, and she was having a lot of issues with her family, and she was telling Chico, I know, I learned about the 490 times that we must forgive, and my husband doesn't respect me, my sons, they pay no attention to me, I have forgiven them over and over, and I've forgiven them 490 times. But what can I do now? What can I still don't have that liberty, that freedom that I thought I was going to get. And Chico says, Emmanuel here is next to me. He says, my daughter, Emmanuel here is next to me. And he's saying that it's 490 times for each offense. For each thing that was done against you. Not in total against everybody, for each one of them. And then obviously the woman left. But can you imagine how hard that is? But we'll get there. We will get there. And just to recap then, Abigail's words were, what could he do to acquire a perfect understanding of Christ's design? Love. What could he do for his soul to reach such an elevated expression of effort in Jesus Christ? Work. What measures could he adopt against such destructive discouragement? Hope nonetheless. How was he to reconcile the grand lessons of the gospel with human indifference? Forgive. And to recap all those things, now I'll give you the last piece that appears right after this. For those who are wondering, why Who are these companions that he's talking about in his title of the lecture today? This is the final piece. Experiencing a peace unknown to him until then, he, Saul, believed that he had been reborn at that moment to a very different existence. He would guard Abigail's words forever. Love, work, hope, and forgiveness would be his inseparable companions.
That was awesome.
You all have a blessed week, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Good job.
Wow, got a lot of people today. Nice. Thank you, Yuri, for the amazing talk. Amazing talk. I'm going to leave this up here as we do our final prayer. And I'm going to go back home and I'm going to pull out the book and read it for probably the third or fourth time and put some little post-its on my mirror. Love, work, hope, and forgiveness. Very good. Okay, so I'd like to ask you all just to join me in an opening prayer. We're going to have our passes, which is just the, receiving energy from the good spirits. For those at home, maybe you'd like to put a glass of water and just do your own meditation, but be with us. So let's start. I'll ask the pass givers to take their places. And let's, again, calm our minds, having heard this very inspirational talk of today. But let's now re-establish our connections with the good spirits that are here, always guiding us. Sometimes we're blind to their help, but they're always there with us. And now this is an opportunity to really connect and receive the good energies. So thank you once again, all those good spirits, and so be it.
Amen.
So as we come to the end of our meeting today, let us all reflect on the message we received. Take the example of our Master Jesus, of Paul, all the other good disciples that left us so much good advice, so much guidance. Let us be aware of our actions. There is so much we can do in this world. Our interactions with our friends, our neighbours, our family, co-workers. Let us be an example of love, of work, of hope and forgiveness. So when we look at this world, there's so much suffering, feel a little discouraged in that we're incapable of helping those in need, so many in need. But let's just spread that message of love, of hope, not just to those who are suffering, but hope and guidance to those who perhaps through their mindless actions are creating so many problems in this world today. Let's send our love to them so they can see the light of their actions and, like Saul, change course for the betterment of humankind. So again, just to finalize, let's thank those good spirits, the benefactors, our Master Jesus, for the kindness, the guidance, and as always, let's put it into practice every moment we have the opportunity. Thank you so much, and so be it. Amen. Oh, thank you, everyone. It's great to see so many faces here. Just a reminder, when we have the symposium in 3 weeks' time, 3 weekends, we've got 2 more weekends before this starts, there'll be no meeting here on a Sunday because most of the workers will be up in Orlando. But we do have 2 more good meetings this month. Okay? So thanks again. Have a great week, everyone.